Chief Dan George was 71 years old when he earned an Academy Award nomination for Best Supporting Actor. Before that, he had spent 6 decades living an ordinary working man's life, hauling freight on the docks of Vancouver, felling timber in logging camps, and driving a school bus to keep his family fed. He was, by every measure, the industry used, invisible. The world passed him by without a thought. And then, something shifted. At an age when most men have already collected their pension and retreated from public life, he walked into Hollywood, carrying a lifetime of quiet endurance. He didn't just get a role, he stopped the room. His name was Chief Dan George, and the journey that led him to that moment began not with triumph, but with a small boy being stripped of everything he was. He was 5 years old when the government took his language from him. 5 years old when they told him his name was wrong, his words were wrong, his people were wrong. He would spend the next 66 years holding all of that inside. And when he finally answered, it wasn't with fury, it wasn't with bitterness. It was with something those who tried to erase him never expected. He answered with dignity. There is a line he made famous, a prayer spoken flat on his back in the dirt, dressed as a man preparing for his own death. My heart soars like a hawk. Hold on to that line. By the time this story reaches its end, you'll know exactly what it cost him to speak those words, and exactly why they moved a nation to tears. This is the story of a man who was told to disappear and simply refused to. He was born on the 24th of July, 1899, on Burrard Reserve No. 3, on the north shore of the inlet near Vancouver. His people knew him as Tsleil-Waututh. His father was a chief. His world was the water, the old-growth forest pressing in from every side, and a language that had been alive on that land for thousands of years before a single European ship ever appeared on the horizon. It was a full world, a rich one. Then, just after his 5th birthday, they came for him. In 1904, the boy was sent to St. Paul's Mission School, and the erasure began on the very first day. The school told him his name, Tsleil-Waututh, no longer existed. He would be called George, taken from his father's imposed English name. A 5-year-old sitting in an unfamiliar building, suddenly carrying a stranger's name. Just like that, the self he had been given at birth was gone. It didn't stop there. Inside those walls, the children were forbidden to speak their own languages, forbidden to observe the ceremonies and beliefs their grandparents had passed down across generations. If a child slipped and let the old words come out, punishment followed. Think about what that means for a moment. A small boy, punished for instinctively speaking the only language his mother had ever used with him, punished for the sound of home. And yet the pull of home never died. Every 2 weeks, young George would catch the streetcar to the end of its line, step off into the dark, and then walk 7 miles through the night to reach his family for a single Friday evening. 7 miles in the dark, just for a few hours of being himself again. That detail alone tells you everything about the kind of man he was becoming. 7 miles. That's how far young Dan George had to walk each day just to reach a school that told him his language was wrong, his culture was something to be buried, and his voice was not his own. His sons spoke about it openly years later, and the words were hard to hear. The damage that experience left behind wasn't something Dan George ever fully shook. It lived in him. Hold that image for a moment. A boy made to feel that everything natural about him was a problem. Because one day, that same boy, with that same voice they tried to silence, would stand before 32,000 people and stop them cold. But before any of that, there was a much longer road. How does a child who was taught to be ashamed of who he is grow into the man who speaks for an entire people? It didn't happen overnight. It didn't happen in a classroom or on a stage. It happened on the docks, in the forest, and through decades of hard, quiet labor. After he left the mission school around the age of 17, there was no clear path waiting for him, no opportunities lined up, no one rolling out a welcome mat. He went straight into the forest and picked up an axe, cutting timber for 3 years. It was relentless physical work, the kind that leaves marks on a man's body and shapes the way he carries himself for the rest of his life. Then in 1923, a door opened through family connection. His father-in-law arranged for him to get one of the most sought-after positions a working man on the waterfront could hope for. Dan George became a longshoreman on the docks of Vancouver, and he didn't just pass through, he stayed, not for a year, not for 5. He worked those docks, on and off, for 27 years. Think about what those 27 years actually held. He was there through the great labor strikes of the 1920s, when workers pushed back against impossible conditions and fought for something better. He was still there when the Depression hit in the 1930s, and the dock work dried up almost entirely. During those lean years, he kept his family fed by hunting and cutting lumber, doing whatever the land and his own hands could provide. That kind of resourcefulness doesn't come from ambition alone. It comes from necessity and from character. He had married a Squamish woman named Amy when he was still young, barely past boyhood himself, and together they built a life and raised their children through all of those difficult decades. There was nothing glamorous about it. No recognition, no applause, no one taking note of what it cost him day after day. He was invisible in the way that working people often are, laboring hard while the wider world looked straight through them. He lifted, he hauled, he showed up, and he never once made a public complaint about the weight of it. For most men, that life, the work, the family, the quiet endurance, would be the whole story. A working man who gave his best years to hard labor and then eased into old age without much fanfare. For the first 50 years of his life, that's exactly the arc everyone around Dan George expected to see. So what happens to a man like that when the work that defined him is suddenly taken away? The year was 1947. Dan George was 48 years old, still on the Vancouver waterfront, still doing what he had always done. Then, a swing load of timber moved the wrong way. One moment, one violent, unpredictable shift of weight, and everything changed. He described it himself, and no screenwriter would dare try to improve on his words. No bones were broken, he said, but my leg and hip muscles were smashed to hamburger. Smashed to hamburger. That phrase lands like the accident itself, blunt, painful, and impossible to dress up. That was it for the docks. The 27 years were over. The strongest chapter of his working life closed in a single instant, not with a retirement party or a handshake, but with a swing load of wood and a body that couldn't take what it absorbed. A man who had anchored his entire sense of self in the strength and reliability of his own body now had to figure out who he was without it. That's not a small reckoning. That's the kind of moment that either breaks a person completely or quietly redirects them towards something none of them saw coming. By most measures, a man approaching 50 with a shattered body and a family depending on him had every reason to give up. No savings, no safety net. A lifetime of hard physical work had left him with almost nothing to show for it except the injuries. But Dan George didn't fold. He got back on his feet, took whatever work was available, and kept moving forward the way men of his generation did, without complaint and without ceremony. That meant construction sites. It meant crane work, the kind of job that demands both strength and focus, neither of which came easy after what his body had been through. And eventually, it meant climbing behind the wheel of a school bus and driving children through the streets of North Vancouver every single day. Steady work, honest work, the kind most people never think twice about. Stop for a moment and consider what that looked like. A future Academy Award nominee, a man who would one day earn the praise of Hollywood's finest directors, picking up a route, checking his mirrors, and easing a bus full of kids through morning traffic. Not one of those children had any idea who was driving them. They saw a bus driver, nothing more, nothing less. And in a way, neither did he, not yet. But that accident, as brutal and as costly as it was, had done something unexpected. By stripping away his ability to rely on his body, it had quietly opened a door he never knew existed. A man who can no longer haul lumber, who can no longer depend on his physical strength to carry him through life, has to find another way to matter, another way to be heard. What came next would catch almost everyone off guard, including Dan George himself. Number 4. The chief of his people. In 1951, leadership arrived not as an opportunity but as a duty. Dan George's father had served as chief of the Burrard Band, the people known today as the Tsleil-Waututh Nation, a Coast Salish community rooted along the shores of Burrard Inlet. When the time came for that responsibility to pass, it passed to his son. No fanfare, no campaign. That was simply how it worked. For the next 12 years, Dan George led his people, not from comfort, not from any position of wealth or political influence. He led them from within the community itself, the way his father had, and his father's father before that. He absorbed the weight of their struggles. He sat with their sorrows. He represented them in a world that, more often than not, had very little interest in hearing what they had to say. And here is why this matters so much to everything that follows. Every role he would later play on screen, every elder radiating quiet authority, every chief carrying the dignity of a people on his shoulders, none of it required him to reach for something he didn't already know. He had lived those years. He had held that weight in his actual hands. The performance was already inside him, built through experience, not craft school. He put it plainly himself, with that characteristic ease that never left him. "I was an Indian chief for 12 years, he told a reporter, a slight smile behind the words. "So I really didn't have to do much acting." Only a man fully at peace with who he is can say something that quietly funny about a gift that serious. There's no pretension in it, no false modesty either, just a man telling the truth. By 1963, his time as chief had run its course. He was 63 years old. Decades of labor, loss, and leadership had left their mark on him physically. By any conventional reading of a man's biography, this was the closing chapter. The long middle stretch of a life well lived, winding down toward a quiet finish. That's how most stories end. Dan George's story had other plans. Something was about to happen that almost never happens in real life. Not a second act, a full restart. A man in his 7th decade, a former chief and retired school bus driver, was about to discover that his most consequential years hadn't happened yet, that the world hadn't actually seen him, not really. Number 5. The accidental actor. There was no audition, no agent, no carefully timed career pivot. What happened was pure accident, the kind that arrives without warning and rearranges everything that comes after it. The CBC, Canada's national broadcaster, was in production on a television series called Caribou Country. It was a drama set in the rural interior of British Columbia, and it featured a recurring character named Old Antoine, an aging Indigenous elder whose presence anchored several of the show's storylines. The actor who had been cast in that role fell seriously ill. The production didn't have weeks to spare. They needed someone who could step in fast, someone who looked the part and felt authentic to it. Within days, a name came up from an unexpected direction. Someone suggested they reach out to the old chief who drove the school bus in North Vancouver. That suggestion was about to change everything. Dan George was about 60 years old when someone asked him to audition for a role. He had no formal training, no acting background, and absolutely no personal desire to stand in front of a camera. He was a working man, a laborer, someone who had never spent a single hour in a drama class. And yet, when the audition happened, he got the part. What followed genuinely surprised everyone who witnessed it. This man, with no preparation and no technique anyone could point to, turned out to be one of the most naturally gifted performers people in the industry had ever encountered. Critics were not being generous when they praised him. One wrote that he played the role to ultimate perfection. That is not the kind of language critics throw around easily. The stage noticed him too. A playwright named George Riga became so moved by what Dan George brought to a performance that he did something almost unheard of. He rewrote an entire play around this one man. The play was called The Ecstasy of Rita Joe, and Riga was direct about what he had done. The character of the father, he said, was Dan George. Not inspired by him, not loosely based on him. The role and the man had become the same thing entirely. There is something worth sitting with in all of that. Everything the mission school had tried to destroy in that 5-year-old boy. His heritage, his language, his entire way of moving through the world, turned out to be the very source of his power on stage and on screen. The qualities they had labeled as primitive or inconvenient were the exact qualities that made audiences stop breathing. The institution that tried to erase him had, without knowing it, tried to erase something irreplaceable. But performing in a local television production and standing in front of 32,000 people are two very different things. One requires talent, the other requires something closer to courage. The 6th stop on this journey is the day Dan George silenced a stadium. The date was the 1st of July 1967, Canada's 100th birthday. The country was in a celebratory mood, and the event at Empire Stadium in Vancouver reflected that. 32,000 people packed into the seats, flags in hand, ready to mark a century of nationhood. Organizers invited the dignified old chief to the stage. They expected something brief, something warm, something that would give the crowd a comfortable feeling about the 100 years they were celebrating. That is not what happened. Dan George stood up and began to speak. He called what he delivered a lament for Confederation, and from the first words out of his mouth, the tone in that stadium shifted. This was not a blessing. This was not a performance designed to make anyone comfortable. It was the quiet, steady voice of a man who had watched his people pay the price for every one of those 100 years. When I fought to protect my land and my home, he told them, I was called a savage. He paused. When I neither understood nor welcomed his way of life, I was called lazy. He kept going. The white man's strange customs, which I could not understand, pressed down upon me until I could no longer breathe. Simple words, plain sentences, no theatrics, no raised voice, no performance in the conventional sense. And yet 32,000 people went completely still. Think about what was happening in that stadium. People had come expecting a party. They had come with their families, their children, their small paper flags. They were seated in the sun, ready to cheer. And instead, a soft-spoken old man stood before them and began, calmly and without apology, to tell them what the last century had actually looked like from the other side of it. The silence that fell was not polite. It was the kind of silence that comes when people suddenly realize they are hearing something true. Here is what made Dan George genuinely different from anyone else who might have stood in that spot. He did not let the speech end in anger. He did not leave the crowd buried under the weight of what he had said. He turned. Like the thunderbird of old, he said, I shall rise again out of the sea. His voice stayed steady. I shall grab the instruments of the white man's success, his education, his skills, and with these new tools, I shall build my race into the proudest segment of your society. That was the turn. Not forgiveness exactly, and not surrender. Something more like defiance wrapped in dignity, a declaration that his people were not finished, had never been finished, and were not asking for anyone's permission to rise. The lament had become a promise. The silence held for just a moment longer, and then 32,000 people got to their feet. That 5-year-old boy, who had been silenced, told he had no right to open his mouth, had just spoken for every Native person the country had erased from its own story. Remember what he asked for in that speech. The tools of success. Not charity, not sympathy, but the actual instruments a person needs to build something real. Because within 3 years, he was about to pick up the most powerful tool a performer can hold. The question was whether the town that handed it to him would actually let him swing it. Number 7. The role 3 legends turned down. In 1970, a director named Arthur Penn was putting together a film called Little Big Man. Dustin Hoffman was the star, the hottest young actor working in American cinema at that moment. and the story followed a white boy raised between two worlds. At the center of it all was a character called Old Lodge Skins, a Cheyenne elder who adopts that lost boy as his own. Old Lodge Skins was wise, he was funny, he was contradictory and warm, and entirely, unmistakably human. On paper, it was one of the best-written Indigenous characters the industry had ever produced. Here is the part that stops you cold. Before Dan George's name ever came up, that role was offered to three of the most celebrated actors alive: Marlon Brando, Laurence Olivier, Paul Scofield. These weren't just famous names, they were the standard everyone else in the craft was being measured against. And one by one, each of them passed. For reasons that history hasn't fully recorded, the part made its way to an old chief from British Columbia who had started acting in his 60s with no formal training and no Hollywood connections. What he did with that opportunity would change what American cinema believed was possible. For 50 years, Hollywood had shown Native people as a single thing, the faceless silhouette on the far side of the hill, useful as a threat, useful as a target. Gone from the frame the moment the hero rode through. That was the template. That was the only story the industry knew how to tell. Dan George walked onto that screen and tore it apart without raising his voice. His Old Lodge Skins didn't fit the template, because the template had no room for someone this complete. He teased Dustin Hoffman's character with genuine affection. He grieved with a weight that landed in your chest. He was hilarious in moments you didn't expect. He loved openly, without apology. For the first time in the living memory of the American movie-going audience, a Native elder on screen was a full human being, not a symbol, not a backdrop, not a warning, a person. The production details George shared about making the film are worth sitting with. The aging makeup required 4 to 5 hours in the chair every single day before he could step in front of a camera. That kind of physical commitment alone would exhaust most performers. But what he brought to the role went deeper than makeup. He said he modeled Old Lodge Skins on his own great-granduncle, a man who had lived to be 110 years old. That great-granduncle had carried memories of a world that existed before the arrival of white settlers, and he had passed those stories to George directly. This wasn't research. This wasn't an actor doing background reading and building a character from the outside in. This was memory. This was inheritance. The dignity George put on screen wasn't something he invented for the cameras. It was something he had been given and was now returning to the world. And then there was the scene, one single scene that would carry his name out of that film and into a different kind of conversation entirely. Number 8. Sometimes the magic works. What does a man do when the script finally gives him permission to face death on his own terms? Old Lodge Skins decides that his time has come. He prepares himself with the seriousness of someone who has been waiting for this moment, who has earned the right to meet it standing. He dresses in his finest regalia, the clothes a man puts on when he wants the world to see him clearly. He climbs to a high place, away from the noise of everything below. He offers a prayer to the open sky, quiet and unhurried, the words landing like something that has always been true. "Thank you for making me a human being," he prays. "Thank you for helping me to become a warrior." Then he lies down in the tall grass and closes his eyes and waits for death to come and collect him. The scene holds, the silence holds, and death does not come. Instead, it begins to rain. Just a few drops at first, falling soft against the old man's face, pulling him back from the edge of wherever he was going. His eyes flutter open. He stares up at a gray, indifferent sky, and then, with comic timing so perfectly calibrated it could only belong to this moment, this man, this film. He pushes himself upright and delivers one of the most quietly devastating lines in Western cinema. Well, sometimes the magic works. Sometimes it doesn't. The audience laughed first, then went silent, then wept, all within the space of 10 seconds. Because what they had just watched wasn't a performance in any conventional sense. It was something rarer and harder to name. An old man had looked death in the face, shrugged with dignity, and told the truth about being human. And that man, Chief Dan George, insisted that moment came entirely from within himself. "That was my own song," he explained afterward. "My own dance, and my own way of talking to the great white spirit. Those things were all my idea." He hadn't trained at a conservatory. He hadn't studied Stanislavski or spent years doing regional theater. He was a man in his 70s, a former longshoreman who had spent the early part of his life working the docks. And he was quietly out inventing people who had devoted their entire professional lives to the craft of acting. The critics recognized it immediately. One wrote simply, "This one Indian will not vanish from your memory." That line didn't need elaboration. It was already complete. Roger Ebert weighed in too, singling out the serenity and deep conviction Dan George brought to the role, a quality that couldn't be taught or rehearsed into existence. It either lived inside a person or it didn't, and in Dan George's case, it ran all the way to the bone. That level of praise was building toward something no one had quite seen before in the history of the Academy Awards. But here's what made that moment so bittersweet. The greatest professional triumph of Dan George's life arrived walking side by side with the most devastating personal loss he would ever suffer. Number 9. The Oscar and the empty chair. When the Academy announced the nominations for Best Supporting Actor, Dan George's name was on the list. Read that again and let it settle. A man born in 1899 on a Squamish reserve, a man who had been taken from his family at the age of 5 and placed in a residential school where he was systematically taught that everything about him, his language, his ceremonies, his identity, had no value, was now at 71 years old, being recognized among the finest performers in the world. He was the first Indigenous North American actor ever nominated for an acting Oscar. Not just the first to win, the first to be nominated. That is not a footnote, that is a seismic shift. He didn't take home the statuette on that April night in 1971. John Mills claimed the award, but to reduce Dan George's story to that outcome would be to miss the point entirely. The New York Film Critics Circle named him Best Supporting Actor. So did the National Society of Film Critics. The people who studied the craft most seriously, who spent their professional lives parsing the difference between performance and truth, they knew exactly what they had witnessed. They gave him the recognition the Academy ballot had denied him, and they did it without hesitation. Dan George understood the weight of what he had accomplished, and he was clear-eyed about what it meant beyond his own career. "I don't want the Indians called second-class people anymore," he said. That wasn't a casual comment. It was a statement of purpose. He had walked into Hollywood with a mission, to give a name and a face and a soul to his people on the largest cultural stage available to him. And he had delivered on that mission in full. He had made the world see. But now listen carefully, because this is where the story shifts into something that hurts to tell. That same year, while the nominations were being celebrated and the cameras were turning and Hollywood was finally beginning to pay attention, his wife Amy died, his partner of more than 50 years. The Squamish girl he had married when they were both barely more than children, the woman who had been beside him through the dock work and the poverty and the obscurity and the late reinvention and the slow, improbable climb toward something extraordinary. She was gone before she could stand beside him at the top of it all. He had reached a height no man of his people had ever reached before in that industry. He had changed what was possible. He had redrawn the boundary of who belonged in that world and how they deserved to be seen. And the one person he needed most to share it with wasn't there. His son would reflect on this years later, quietly and with great sadness, saying that his father never truly healed from that loss. That after Amy died, something essential in Dan George went with her. That in the end, he died of a broken heart. The boy who was once silenced had found a way to speak to the entire world. But the world, in its complicated way, had taken something from him in exchange. So, how does a man carry that kind of weight, that kind of loss, and still deliver one of the most cherished performances in the history of the American Western? That is the question sitting at the heart of everything we're about to talk about. Number 10. Endeavor to persevere. In 1976, Clint Eastwood was deep in production on the Outlaw Josey Wales, a film he was both directing and starring in. He needed someone to fill the role of Lone Watty, an aging Cherokee man who becomes Josey's traveling companion on the run. This wasn't a minor supporting part. Lone Watty was meant to be Josey's conscience, his mirror, his friend. The role needed weight. It needed lived experience. Eastwood gave the part to Dan George, and what the two of them built together on screen is the kind of thing audiences don't easily forget. There's a monologue in that film that fans are still quoting nearly 5 decades later. Lone Watty recalls being taken to Washington as a younger man, dressed up in fine clothes, and paraded in front of the Secretary of the Interior like some kind of exhibit. "They gave us medals for looking so civilized," he says, with that slow, dry delivery that cuts right through you. The officials shook their hands warmly, looked them in the eye, and told them to endeavor to persevere. And then, Lone Watty says, after his people had sat with those grand words long enough and turned them over in their minds, they declared war on the Union. It's funny. It's absolutely devastating, and it lands both ways at once, which is exactly the point. That was Dan George telling the truth about his people again, only this time wrapped inside a Clint Eastwood Western that tens of millions of Americans were watching from the comfort of their living rooms. The truth got in through a door they didn't expect. Eastwood himself talked openly about how much he loved working with the man. He said Dan George had no formal acting training, none of the technique that drama schools spend years teaching, but he was a storyteller in the oldest sense of the word. Eastwood developed a habit on set of rolling the camera without warning. Dan George first, just letting it run quietly, catching him in the spaces between the scripted lines. What he captured in those moments was something no screenwriter could have planned. Dan George would half remember his lines, drift into something else, and what came out was better than the page. That's not a gap in craft. That's a different kind of craft, entirely. And then, on the 23rd of September, 1981, at the age of 82, Chief Dan George passed away in a hospital in Vancouver. Around 1,200 people filled the cathedral for his funeral service. They came from many walks of life, many communities, many generations. And as the pallbearers carried him out into the open air, the rain came down over the city. It was the same kind of rain that old Lodge Skins had stood beneath on that mountainside in Little Big Man, eyes lifted, waiting for death that didn't come. Now it fell on the man himself, the real man, who had given that moment to the world. Do you remember the prayer from the very beginning of this story? "My heart soars like a hawk." It wasn't a line written for him by a Hollywood screenwriter. It was the title of his own book of poetry. Those were his words, from his own hand, describing his own inner life. Think about what that means. A man who was stripped of his name at 5 years old, told to speak a language not his own, told to leave behind everything that made him who he was, chose to describe his soul in terms of soaring, not surviving, not enduring. Soaring. He wrote about the beauty of the trees, the softness of the air, the fragrance of the grass, and his heart, he wrote, soars, not soared, soars, present tense, as if it never stopped. They took his name, they took his language, they silenced a small boy, and told him to become someone else entirely. And his answer to all of that was a life so full of grace, so full of quiet dignity and genuine warmth, that an entire continent eventually had to stop and pay attention. Not because he was angry, though he had every right to be. Not because he was bitter, though no one would have blamed him. He drew people in with something rarer than rage. He drew them in with dignity, and he held on to it to his very last breath. If this story moved you even a fraction of the way it moved me in putting it together, do one thing for the old chief. Drop his name in the comments. Let the algorithm do what history almost did. Carry Chief Dan George to someone who's never heard of him. someone who might be exactly the person who needs to. Because men like him don't come around often. A decorated actor, a poet, a chief, a voice for Indigenous people at a time when very few platforms were handed to them. He earned every bit of recognition he received, and he deserved far more than he got. So leave his name below. Share this video with someone who loves classic Hollywood or someone who knows nothing about it. Either way, Chief Dan George's story is worth passing on. Thank you for spending this time with us here at Golden Secrets. It genuinely means a lot. See you in the next one.